Thank you. Sorry, the microphone scared me.
You can do without it if you want.
No, I'll try and figure that I'm holding it if I can. So my plan for what I was going to talk about has been disrupted slightly because of David's talk being so fascinating, because I'm preoccupied now with this whole idea of the head clicky thing. Because as someone who's not asexual but has considered whether I fit into the category of grey at various points, the head clicky thing is something I can really relate to. And as I've gone around talking to people about my research, sorry, can I put this away actually?
Yeah, I think it's here.
Did I talk? Can everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, it's this whole idea of the head clicky thing, and the change when you do suddenly understand what someone is talking about when they describe themselves as asexual. Because when I first came across asexuality when I had to make friends with two people who are asexual, and it was in talking to one of them in particular that I started to realise how interesting I found the concept, but also how confusing I found the concept, but in a classical research style, also how interesting I found my own confusion. Because at the time, I just finished doing an MA dissertation about sexual identity, so I spent months reading all this academic literature about sexuality. And the absence of, not just of asexual people, but the absence of the consideration of the possibility that there could be asexual people was so glaringly conspicuous once I noticed it that came to fascinate me as well. And in my, when I started my research, I set out just to try and get some basic qualitative data about the asexual community, because at that point, which I think was 4 years ago now, it was striking, firstly, how little research there was, but secondly, how little it seemed to have occurred to these researchers to actually ask asexual people, what is it like to be asexual? There's a great deal of value to a lot of psychological research. I'm not dismissing it by any means, but the tradition of research that I'm coming from is about actually talking to people, understanding how they experience the world, how they see themselves in their own terms. And I found that a really interesting movement where simultaneously I'd expected the asexual community, because I was talking about it as a community and other people talked about it as a community, to be homogenous, or at least to have some sort of really core unified identity. And yet it soon became apparent just how diverse the asexual community is at the same time, and how the same processes which, as people were drawn to it and they talked about their shared experiences and their divergent experiences online, how that simultaneously seemed to entrench some degree of shared identity, but also help people recognise and identify their differences. And yet, the community seems to become stronger in the process. But in my research and from reading online and from other conversations I've had and other things people have told me since, there are some near universal experiences that asexual people have. And one of them, as far as I'm aware, is the experience of bewilderment, non-comprehension, when asexual people try and tell sexual people about their asexuality. The sense in which many sexual people, and I include myself in this, they just don't get it. Some people might just be unpleasant bastards who are acting in prejudiced ways because they just like stigmatise. But I think that a lot of the time, reactions people have to asexuality can often be a result of that lack of comprehension. That because they literally, on a conceptual level, on an intellectual level, do not get asexuality as a concept. They act in ways which are inadvertently stigmatising and marginalising. And so I think that the head clicky thing is at the root of a lot of this. Because I've tried to write about this in terms of what I've called the sexual assumption. The presupposition that sexual attraction is uniform and it's universal. So that everyone experiences sexual attraction and it's the same thing in all cases. And what I take the head clicky thing, and apologies, I'm going to start using that phrase more, to mean is that experience of when you realise that assumption is not true. And if you're not yourself asexual, and you suddenly realise that the sexual assumption isn't the case, you start to reflect in a way that previously isn't possible about your own sexuality. And I think in a way that the emergence of the asexual community, and particularly the very rich language that has emerged and is continuing to emerge out of these discussions, both offline and online, it creates cultural resources which exist objectively, independently of their creators. They're things that are put out there into the world that other people can pick up and use to make sense of themselves. And they're obviously of use to the asexual community, but I think they're of a lot of use to the sexual community as well, because the sexual community, what does that mean? There's no good word to talk about sexual people. I tend to vacillate between saying non-asexuals and sexual people. If you see what I mean, I think there's an absence of an identity as sexual. And the asexual community is playing an integral part in creating the conditions in which people who are not themselves asexual will come to reflect in a way they haven't previously about what their sexuality means. So in a similar way, for instance, to how it took the emergence of people calling themselves homosexual for heterosexual to emerge as an identity. In terms of what that label refers to, there were obviously already heterosexual people. But in terms of actually labelling that, until there was a recognition that there was some other, that there were people who weren't this way, it didn't make sense for anyone to call themselves heterosexual, to think of themselves as straight. And you can see this in both the gap between, etymologically, the words heterosexual and homosexual were coined at the same time in a translation by the same person. And yet, homosexual came into public use a lot earlier than heterosexual came into everyday public use. And similarly, I'm really intrigued about the impact that all this increasing visibility of the asexual community is going to have on the wider discourses of sexuality in society. Because I think it's opening up space, and it's opening up a very rich and productive space, which is going to have a lot of impacts for a lot of people, some small, some great, but all very significant. I think there really is a historical turning point in sexual culture and how sexual culture changes over time. And a lot of it revolves around this head clicky thing. And as more people start to become aware of asexuality, I think it is making the world a much nicer, more tolerant place, and it's opening up the space within which people can recognise and crucially articulate the diversity which characterises sexual experience. Because at the moment, even when there is an identification of an asexual community, some people will still look at this in terms of a zero-sum thing. You're either sexual or you're asexual. Whereas I think everyone, to varying degrees, is going to fall somewhere in between, but it's the lack of any language to identify that in-between bit. Yeah, thanks. So, sorry, that was a slightly rambling talk, but as I say, I rewrote it.
Can you hear me when I speak like this? Because I think I have a tendency to. Okay, this is, I think, the first time I've used the microphone since 10 years ago, where people made me list names at an athletics event and I didn't actually see the people I was talking to. So this obviously isn't the case here. I've never talked to anyone who was so close to me. My talk is going to be a little bit different from Mark's, because what I'm going to do is present you a very, very short and condensed version of my research, which is my PhD project. So to give you a little bit of context, I'm based as a doctoral research student in the Center for Interdisciplinary Gender Studies at the University of Leeds, and that research center itself is housed in a department for sociology and social policy, so I'm also very much based in social research traditions, specifically feminist and queer methodologies, if that means anything to anyone. So I'm at the end of my first year now, which is the stage at which I should kind of have a sort of proposal of what's going to happen. So if my ethical approval goes through, my risk assessment goes through, then I'm going to start my field work in a few months. So I also have very recently created a very nice, pretentious working title, which is Asexual Intimate Borderlands, Exploring Boundaries and Liminal Spaces of Personal Relationships. And what that means It's basically that I'm focusing on qualitative research on asexual experiences of intimacy. So the way Mark took away the head clicky thing from David, I'm going to take the intimacy thing from David. So I'm going to run you through 3 concepts that sort of make up the whole hypothesis, hopefully, alongside my qualitative data and interviews. And if I have time after that, I think I would like to talk a little bit about the process of doing research and about the frameworks in which that happens, because I think if you're not an academic yourself and if you haven't really engaged with research yourself, this might be an area that might seem a bit shoddy to some people, because a lot of the time social research might just be might give off the impression that you just go out, find some people, talk to them, and they just invent something basically. That's not actually how it happens. So if we have time for that, maybe we can spend a few minutes on that. So, like I said, I'm going to be focusing on asexual intimacies, which means that I need to define my concept of intimacy, which is very much geared towards effective social relations. I want to talk about relationships of strong emotional quality, of personal significance, and relationships in which there is trust between people and possibility for vulnerability. And if any of you know Adrienne Rich, who's an American poet, I'm not sure if she recently died or not, but she used this concept of survival relationships in a paper from 1980, which was one of the first papers that talked about the fact that writings about gay male experiences don't actually reflect the experiences of lesbian women. And what she talked about was that in survival relationships, women form strong emotional bonds with other women, meaning with people who are not their spouses, in order to find more emotional fulfillment. And this is partially what my concept of intimacy is about. Because if you look at academic literature, you will see intimacy as very strongly tied to love, especially romantic love, which is in turn very much connected with the erotic. So you have, you can go very far back talking about love. You have these, ancient Greek categories of eros and philia and agape, which then developed into worshipful love. And you have today the concept of platonic love, which is sometimes, I think, related to asexuality. So what I want to do is look at these categories that exist and sort of not apply, but merge them with asexuality and see what happens. Because usually what I hear from asexual people and what I hear from other people who aren't necessarily asexual, and what I see from my own experience is that the actual reality of people's relationships doesn't necessarily reflect how these categories get construed. So there's 2 authors from London here, actually, Rosie and Butchin, who talk about the friendship-romance divide, that there is no real terminology to talk about relationships that transcend romance and friendship, or that that find some sort of mixture of the two. I think in the asexual community there is the term of zucchini. That shows a bit the need to invent new terms in order to be able to adequately reflect people's lives. So I want to bring asexuality into a discussion of intimacy and hopefully arrive at a possibility to reconceptualize the term of intimacy. It's quite interesting for me to be here at a predominantly activist event, which deals a lot with identity politics, and David talked about community cohesion and all these things, which all very much hinges on the possibility that people can identify as asexual. And this is partly what I want to do in my research, which is I want to talk to people who identify as asexual, but I also want to talk to people who fall into a category of what I think C.J. Chesson has called potential asexuals, which are people who may practically be asexual but who do not use the terminology or who don't want to use the terminology. People who relate to other people asexually, which is actually something that's really common if you think about it. Because when you go back to the idea of intimacy, what happens is that the absence of sexuality is only considered weird or strange if it's in a romantic relationship or a relationship that's traditionally sexual. If you think about what's common in a sibling relationship, for example, the idea that that could even be sexual in some regard is a complete taboo in this culture, and especially, if there's a possibility involved that there might be children or anything like that. So asexuality is actually something that's really pervasive. I mean, we are relating now asexually, and not just because the majority of you is asexual. So, you will notice that I'm not a big Freudian, even though I'm from Vienna. Eventually I want to relate the concept of asexuality and intimacy to the idea of the possibility of an intimate citizenship. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the concept of sexual citizenship. It's basically ideas around the legal regulation of personal relationships and private lives. And what happens at the moment is that in terms of intimacy, there is a strong focus on recognizing a certain kind of relationships, namely relationships that can be termed a marriage or a civil partnership, which are always assumed to be romantic and therefore assumed to be sexual. So what I hope to achieve eventually through my research is sort of bring up a discussion that intimacy it's not. I don't want to bring. I'm not necessarily concerned with bringing up a legal recognition of asexual relationships as such, because I'm a bit wary of going in that direction. What I'm rather concerned with is, acknowledging and getting other people to acknowledge that people's primary or significant close personal relationships, whatever they are, must not necessarily be sexual or romantic.
Can you guys hear me, or do I need the microphone?
All right.
Excellent. Well, I did my undergrad thesis on asexuality on Avon, so kind of small fry in the broad context of asexual research, but nonetheless, I did do a part. And I'm just, like you just did, Mercedes, sorry. I'm just going to talk about my research and what I wrote, and yeah. So, firstly, I should run through the methods that I used. I just finished studying anthropology, and the going method in anthropology is called ethnography. And if you're unfamiliar with that, it basically means going into a group setting and talking to the people there and hanging out with them and recording your observations. It's basically a kind of deep hanging out. You just sit around chatting and take notes, like nothing more than that. But because anthropologists, need a kind of technical term for everything, we call it participant observation and all this sort of stuff. So I took part in the Avon forums as anyone else, and at the time, if a handful of you probably might have seen me there, I had this giant red warning in my forum signature to let everyone know that I was kind of snooping around on them and then looking at what you guys are up to. I'm not actually asexual. A friend of mine is asexual, and they directed me to Avon before I decided to write my thesis on it, and I was just kind of fascinated by the language that was developing and the way people were talking about asexuality. And it was something that I'd heard the term about once before, a few years before, but I never actually looked into it. And it was kind of fascinating as a sexual person, the divisions that are made. So I decided to explore that, and I undertook an ethnography and did that. And basically, from looking at the experiences of asexuals, and although every asexual story is kind of different, I did see some commonalities. And I was led to the conclusion that asexuality isn't a way to be a person in much of the online world. And it's only been in the last about 10 years or so with Avon and with the LiveJournal page and so on that asexuality has been made into a new category of personhood and a way to interact with others as a person. And I'm going to go into that, but first I need to kind of like give a kind of basic theoretical background, which I really hope doesn't bore you. And I have to take this all the way over to a discussion about autism, just to illustrate the point, but it's got nothing to do with asexuality itself. But basically, a philosopher called Ian Hacking wrote a great article about making up people, and he specifically takes autism. Autism is a disorder or a spectrum of disorders characterized by social difficulties, language impairment, an obsession with literalness and maintaining the same order, and a bunch of other stuff. It's not particularly important to set down a proper definition, I'm just making the example. But his point is that autism was introduced as a diagnosis in about the 1940s and began to be given to more and more people throughout the 1950s and so on and so forth. But it doesn't make sense to say that there were more autists after the 1950s, or that there were no autists before 1950 and now there are lots. Because autism is a name we give to a condition or a set of symptoms. And those symptoms would have existed in the population, presumably, before the diagnosis was made. So rather, it's not that autism didn't exist, it's that autism wasn't a way to be a person. People didn't experience themselves as autists, they didn't interact with others as autists, they didn't talk to their friends and family and employers and counsellors and so on as autists. But after the 1950s, people began to do that. It became a category of personhood within which one could live and interact. And a similar kind of thing is at work with asexuality now. And this is kind of tied into sexual identity more broadly and the history of how we think about sex and sexuality. Michel Foucault is he's basically the big daddy of modern Western analysis of sex. And he wrote this landmark work, which he died before he could finish it, but he wrote The History of Sexuality. And in it he talks about how the idea of sexual orientation was kind of born from the 16th century onwards. And at that time, experts began to examine sexuality as an objective phenomenon and an object of science. They began to categorize and classify different kinds of sexuality and types of people. And before that, people didn't talk or think about themselves as existing within these categories. If you went back, he specifically uses the example of the Greeks. If you went back in time to them and said, I am attracted to men, or I'm attracted to the opposite sex, they'd be like, all right, sure we all are. We all have a bit of sex with men, like, because they didn't. Well, they did. They're constantly going at it. But for them, it was more about practices and behaviours, and they did have names for specific roles, basically, and so on, and they did have associations. But it was considered ethically unhealthy to engage in certain kinds of behaviours, rather than being part of an intrinsic attraction. And throughout the 17th and 20th centuries, as these experts began to make concrete sexological categorizations of sexual orientations, people's identities became more and more tied up with what their orientation was. And actually, like Mark said, first the homosexual was created as this kind of person, and then in counter to that, the heterosexual. And now we have the bisexual and a bunch of other ones like pansexuality and so on. So between the 17th and 20th centuries, a new kind of sexual subjectivity was forming, where people look at themselves as categories of person in terms of sexuality. And before that, people didn't think about it. And I can now tie this back into what this actually has to do with asexuality. And the thing is that asexuality doesn't exist in most of the world as a category of personhood in the same way that those do. As you go through life, you go through puberty and so on, you have strange feelings and urges and so on or whatever. Maybe you don't, maybe most of the people in this room didn't. But you have certain feelings for certain people, and society gives you what you could say maps of what your orientation is. There's heterosexual and bisexual and homosexual, and sometimes a few other less well-known ones. But that's not the case for asexuality. You guys just haven't had that for a long time. And so, for most of us, we go through life, especially if you're heterosexual, it's quite easy. But you go through life, you have certain feelings, and then you have a name for yourself. With asexuality, it's like if someone's asking you, what's your orientation? And then they say, you know, you can have straight, gay or bi, or gay or lesbian, and bi. And then there's no like none of the above option for you guys. But then, around the turn of the millennium, the live starting with the Nat, where is he? You did the great history of the asexual movement, so I'm not going to repeat that. But asexuality began to take form slowly and to turn into what it is now, and the lack of sexual attraction. And suddenly people had a way to be a person and to interact with each other and to talk about themselves as asexuals. And I mean, you can really easily see this on the forums in terms of... sorry, I forgot what I was going to say. In terms, firstly, of people's reactions to asexuals coming out as asexual, people in the offline world, and also in terms of people, what they thought of themselves before they discovered asexuality and discovered that that was a viable way to be a person. And in terms of the latter, I mean, I'm sure if any of you have ever told someone you're asexual, probably some of them were understanding and accepting and just were like, okay, that's fine. And then some of them had like totally adverse reactions, like just like what people were discussing earlier. You should get your hormones checked. You must have been sexually abused. There's something wrong with you. It's just a phase. You need to meet the right person. It's just because you're still a virgin. And if you're not still a virgin, you just need to have really good sex. you like transform into a sexual, like a magic butterfly. I don't fucking get it. Like. But it just reflects that there's no place for asexuality. If you discuss it with most people in the online world, they don't consider it a viable way to be a person. And as well as that, the way asexuals sometimes feel before they discover it, and Nat again was saying that earlier, he had very low self-esteem, he felt like he was broken. You often get people talking about how they conflated their romantic attraction with sexual attraction and didn't understand that it wasn't sexual. Or people who conclude that because they're not heterosexual, they must be homosexual. So for asexuals, or potential asexuals, there can be a lot of headaches about how to see yourself because there's no term for you. And then, of course, you go online and you discover asexuality, and of course it's not the same for everyone because some people are still are trying to figure themselves out, and you've got the whole grey asexual category. But if you hang out in the introduction section on Avon, you'll see loads of people who are just like, I just found out about asexuality, and instantly it just absolutely clicked. I know who I am now. Finally, I have a word to describe myself, and I'm not alone. And it's at that point that asexuality becomes a way to be a person, and you can describe yourself as an asexual. You can say, I'm asexual, and talk to people as an asexual, interact with others as an asexual, in a way that didn't exist before. So basically, my thesis is about that, and about how Avon and other websites act as the grounds for the making of that new category of person. And that's it.
Okay, so question time. Raise your hand. Nobody? Or are you still trying to process what it is you want to ask? Oh, okay.
Well, as a part of this academic research, you need to find out previous academic research that was done. And I think many of us are curious, because you did the yearly researching, what did you find as academic material that existed before you?
To all of us?
You're doing academic work. You?
Well, okay. I'm not sure what the first. Okay, let me think. I think the first piece of research that I found that used the term asexuality that wasn't about plants or fungi or algae, I think was somewhere in the 1970s. Maybe there's this paper by Paul Nurius who relates lack of sexual attraction or lack of sexual desire to depression and low self-esteem, and it's not a specifically very good paper, I think, especially in terms of asexuality, but this is like one of the first things I've found. I think if you were starting to look now, what you would find is, I think, especially with the development of the asexual community, social research and psychological research that starts using the definition of asexual as someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction. I think this is the main sort of trend that's happening now, especially with people who maybe are themselves asexual and use the topic in in their bachelor's thesis or in their master's thesis. And yeah, in terms of what people have published, I think there's sort of a surge of research that's going on right now. If you want to read something really good, read stuff by Mark, because I haven't published anything yet.
Do you know Andrew Hinton? I don't know how to say his name.
Hindle?
Yeah, Andrew H. He's in my head. But I mean, his website, Asexual Explorations, I found fantastic, because when I started to think I want to try and do some research on this, I typed asexual research into Google. Within 10 hits, I found the full bibliography produced by Andrew. Yeah. Yeah, and so if you're interested, the site's fantastic, because I mean, he updates it very regularly. I think it's still completely comprehensive. It has everything that anyone's done listed on there.
English language, at least.
Yeah.
I don't know, they pretty much covered it up.
Anyone else got any questions? Yeah, with a microphone or no, I should be fine. For the non-ACE researchers, did you have any problems researching things because you're not ACE, so you don't really, did you have any problems researching something that you couldn't
Actually
understand
feel.
as well as some who's ACE?
Well, personally, no. I didn't perceive any problems myself, and I can understand why you might think that. But anthropology specifically has a history of examining things that have nothing to do with us. Like, I mean, anthropology is descended from guys going over to Papua New Guinea and just like talking to those guys, and then usually in the beginning being really, really racist. Yeah, it was really, really bad. So not a good heritage there. But I didn't find it particularly difficult to try to understand asexuals. I like to think I'm fairly open-minded, and I just assumed that the way I look at most people who I'm not sexually attracted to, and I just like took that dial and just put it up to 100% and imagine that that's what it's like for asexuals. Is that good? All right. And so I thought I think I had a fairly okay understanding of asexuals. So no, but I have to say that researching asexuals is personally of great interest to me, because for the first time it made salient this separation between romantic attraction and sexual attraction. And in most of the general schema of sexuality we have in the Western world is that these are both the same thing. When you talk about homosexuals, you're talking about people who are attracted romantically and sexually to the opposite or the same sex, and vice versa for heterosexuality. And no one bothers to differentiate it because it's the same thing to most of us. And I never realized that. I took that for granted, and then suddenly I'm on egg and I'm like, hey, never thought of that. But yeah, so.
That was anyone else?
Yeah, what you said at the end, likewise. Very similar experience.
Really eye-opening.
Yeah. And I think it's fun being upfront with people in terms of actually talking about why I was starting to find this so interesting about the categories, and finding that the categories available to you to make sense of your own experience don't fit. And although there is some overlap in my experience, there's also divergence, but I've got a lot of experience in other areas of my life of having that experience, so I just tried to be as open as I could about that. Because I think it is an experience that goes beyond the asexual community. So I'm really interested in the intersections that have come up already with the trans community and also the poly community. Because I've read a lot of trans research and know a few people doing work in the area in the last year or so. And there just seems to be a lot of experiential overlap where it just doesn't fit. The categories available in everyday language just don't work to make sense and articulate who you are.
Leah has her hand up.
Yeah, I have a question. Like, you are talking about asexuality from most of you, as I can see, non-asexual point of view. So you explain to other non-asexual people, and like you saw the cricketing thing from David. And sometimes once I met someone in Avon chat, and he tried to explain to me asexual attraction, which is a very long discussion, we're not at the beginning now. But he told me that, like, trying to explain sexual attraction to asexuals is like trying to explain the difference between green and brown to colorblind people. And I thought about the colorblind example, and it was pretty good. Like, we see colors, like colorblind people see colors, but don't really see the difference between some of the colors. So like, we don't really see hot people, you know? So I was thinking, like, what kind of methods do you use to explain asexuality to non-asexual people from a non-asexual point of view?
Like when talking to the media and stuff, I tend to like in conversations with friends because I mean, this is, as I said, this is where part of my interest comes from because people have asked me, so what are you researching these days? Asexuality. What is that, etc., etc. So it's in that context and with the media that I try to say stuff. And I think I've just tended to fall back on the story that I've been told. Particularly, I mean, because it's both useful and perhaps the bad thing about research, the generalizations about those stories. So not specifically talking about particular individuals, but tendencies that I've observed of the kinds of stories I've been told. So it gives people something to relate to, but I think there is that conceptual barrier, and I don't know if there are metaphors that help people get it. It tends to be, I don't know, that people have to just hear stories and it sits with them for a while. And then they start to realise, like, well, hey, this is how I've experienced it. But I can sort of imaginatively, empathically put myself in the shoes of someone who is other.
Okay.
You know, it's not that you suddenly see the colours yourself. It's that you can imagine what it is like to see the colours. You see what I mean?
If you had to do an elevator pitch, and you just have to explain what asexuality is in like 5 sentences or 2 sentences, what's your elevator pitch?
Spectrum, usually, I guess, to be honest. Which, for convoluted reasons, with my research hat on as opposed to a person doing elevator pitch hat on, I'm not that keen on the spectrum idea. But I think that helps get it across to people that, because I think people intuitively recognise there's much more diversity to our personal experience, and R, meaning the broadest sense of the term R, then we have the resources available to articulate in language. And I think maybe on that level people can relate to a certain extent, to not being able to articulate yourself, not being able to say who you are. Because I think everyone has that experience to varying degrees, but the way culture is structured means systematically some people are in that position much more than others.
Okay. And person over there, hand up.
Thank you. I thought it was really interesting how all
Do you
of
want to
you,
microphone?
might be quiet. I thought it was interesting how each of you in your research had said in your own way about this thing of compartmentalizing people and conditions and aspects of humanity and various other things. I work as a social researcher